very pleased and honored to chair this session. I see some people appearing on my screen. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm very happy to chair this session on it's the launch of the Tip of the Iceberg report. And it's been prepared by our friend Neil Data, who will take the floor in a bit. And I think it's the third report of this kind by his hand. The first one was Restoring the Natural Order, and then there was the Modern Day Crusaders in Europe. And I think we are all familiar with the background, and we are all concerned, I think, with this rise of anti-choice, anti-gender, anti-women, anti-equality, homophobic forces in Europe. And of course, this is not only because people are, going back to old-fashioned ideas. The old saying goes, follow the money, and that applies here as well. Because without money, these forces would not get broad support. There's a lot of money and a lot of power behind it, and a lot of interests, of course. So today, this report is being launched. I've had a quick sneak preview, and it's actually quite shocking. And at the end of the meeting, I will make a couple of proposals for follow-up actions, because it's not enough to analyze. I think then we also need to take action and make sure that European values, equality, gender equality, women's rights, choice, the right to choice, that all those rights are secured in Europe, and that we are not naive in the face of the forces who are trying to destroy this. And basically what they're trying to do is restore or save patriarchy, which I think is a lost battle. But that doesn't mean that we can just sit back and wait for everything to be all right. In particular, because of so much money flowing into the battle to restore patriarchy. One of the things that struck me is the amounts, but Neil is going to say more about that in a bit. We have just since the 1st of January entered a new 7-year budget period, where we have a new fund to protect the European values, basically, rights and justice and what have you. And it's just over double the amount that we're talking about here. And now that fund is for the entire European Union. It's everything that's being made available for NGOs, for civil society, for justice. So just to give you an idea of the forces that are at work. And I think we should also not forget that this kind of money is channeled into not just advocacy, but also litigation, which is more and more important as a tool to advance rights or to actually roll them back. Okay, that's all I wanted to say for today. We have an excellent panel. Before we go to Neil, we will be listening to Petra Beyer, well known to all of you, but I still would like to read out everything she's doing, because it's quite impressive. Not only is she the president of the European Parliamentary Forum, she's also a member of the Austrian National Council and the SPÖ spokesperson for global development, and president of the European Parliamentary. In addition to being president of the EPF, she's also chairperson of the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. She's the member of the Committee on Strategy, Investment and Policy on the IPPF. She's a board member of Parliamentarians for Global Action and treasurer of the International Law and Human Rights Programme. So she spends all her time, day and night, working for women's rights, working for equality, working for human rights. This is really incredibly impressive. So I'll first give the floor to Petra, and then we will go to Neil, to David Paternotte and Claire Provost, but I'll come back to them. Petra, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for this nice introduction. The discussion about the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, the legal tool to protect women from gender-based violence, or the de facto ban of access to safe abortion in Poland, LGBTIQ-free zones and ban of equal marriage, criminalization of sexuality education, and fake news about effective contraceptives. I know, as chair of the Equality Committee of the Council of Europe, that all that does not come out of the blue. This is very well orchestrated all over Europe. And of course, the interesting question is, who is pulling the strings? And where does the resources of the puppet masters come from? This publication we launched today gives some answers, puts light on a structure that is usually clandestine. Being aware and understanding this ultra-conservative movement is essential for those who want to safeguard a modern, inclusive and tolerant Europe. As progressive politicians, we must mobilize and cooperate in order to not fall prey to these religious fundamental extremists, legal and publicity stunts, and send a strong message that the world view they are attempting to impose has no place at all in this millennium. And I, in particular, want to thank Neil Tata, who is not only the author of this publication, but also the secretary of the European Parliamentary Forum. And Neil is investigating these activities of the anti-choice, anti-gender, anti-human rights activity in Europe for many, many years. I would say he is the leading expert in Europe, at least, and shares important information about structures, motives, actors, and now also financial flows on what we are facing today. And I know that because I'm in politics, I'm involved in politics for a long time. It's always a huge advantage to know who are your opponents, how they think, and of course, who are they financially dependent on. So thank you very much for this new publication, and I hope really it will bring light into that, what is really under the water. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Petra. I was just alerted to the fact that Claire Provost will actually not be there because for very good and happy reasons, and she will be replaced by Tatev Hovhannisyan, whom I will introduce later. But now, finally, we're going to Neil Tata, Secretary of the EPF and actually founding father, may I say that? He set up the EPF with the support of IPPF in 2000. So that's 21 years ago, and he's been its Secretary General since 2004. And since the very start, the EPF has grown to its current membership of 30 all-party parliamentary groups on population and development. That's very impressive. And I have to say, on a personal note, I think we have a lot to be grateful for when it comes to Neil. I mean, the work that he has been doing tirelessly over the years, bringing so much information together, because we can all have our views and our political positions, but Neil has always been providing us with the necessary facts and figures and justification. Neil has been instrumental, really key in exposing networks, exposing organizations which on the surface look very friendly and nice, but who actually have an agenda which is very strongly against European values and equality and women's rights. So I would like to start or to introduce you, Neil, with these words of thanks for everything that you've been doing, and that includes the tip of the iceberg, the latest report, which you will now introduce. You have the floor.
Okay, oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you for such an introduction. And also I want to thank you, Sophie and Petra, for joining this webinar, because I know that both of you have had to shift things around in your very busy schedule in order to make it today. So thank you very much. It's a testament also to your commitment to this issue. So I'd just like to start by prefacing this a little bit with what Sophie was mentioning. So this is the third in a series of reports on the anti-gender movement. The first was Restoring the Natural Order on Agenda Europe. The second was on this pseudo-Catholic network called Tradition, Family and Property. And after each of these reports, people were asking me, Neil, do you know anything about the funding behind all of this? Because all of this isn't possible without some important money. And so there was not much information there, but so I decided that what I would do is start looking into this. And so this is the result of this inquiry, which is on the one hand, original research into the financial data of a lot of the anti-gender organizations, plus secondary research based on what was already out there in a lot of different articles and media, mainly at national level. And it's bringing the two of them together and sort of connecting the dots so as to paint a picture about what is funding this movement that is of concern to all of us. Next slide, please. And so as the title suggests, tip of the iceberg, what I'm presenting here is simply what we can actually verify. So it's the visible tip of the iceberg. And then beneath every iceberg, there's a lot more that's hidden beyond view. And I try to provide some glimpse as to what may be hidden. And so the report is structured into three parts. One is, what do we know about the money that we can account for? And for that, we can identify three geographic origins. The second part is really what's beneath the iceberg, and that concerns how the money is raised. And then the third part, I try to explain a bit through case examples how it all fits together. Now, before starting, I just want to have a very quick word on methodology, where this is important to get to have a grounding in, as we're going to be talking about numbers. So in terms of methodology, what I've done is identify a number of organizations and actors which we know are involved in anti-gender activism. So that's activism against abortion, sexual reproductive health and rights, contraception, against LGBT, also to a certain extent against children's rights, against gender writ large, and against certain forms of freedoms and liberties. So I've taken a look at those organizations involved in that, and I was able to assemble a sample of about 120 organizations, and then I just tracked the financial data for all of these, and I was able to find it for a little bit less than half of those organizations. And then I examined the governance structures to see who's related to them. And then from that, we're able to paint a picture about the funding environment behind this movement. And for most of this report, I've covered a 10-year period from 2009 to 18, where that roughly corresponds to 2 mandates of the European Parliament, more or less. And so I thought it was a nice figure. So in terms of overall findings, we were able to identify a total of $707.2 million going into this anti-gender movement. Now, this 707 million comes from 54 organizations which are NGOs, foundations, religious organizations, and in some cases, political parties. And there's 3 main points of origin: US, Russia, EU. The numbers from the US are the most complete because there's good financial transparency regulations. Russia, relatively complete for the official data, but with Russia, there's a whole range of dark money that is by definition not traceable. And then the EU is the most patchwork of incomplete data, where there's simply no requirements for financial transparency in some countries. But given that, we're still able to reach 707 million, which is really just the tippy top of the iceberg. Already with this, we can see it represents a 4-fold increase in funding over 10 years. So if you have 4 times more money now than you did 10 years ago, you can do a lot more than you used to be able to. So that already accounts for a big part of the increase in anti-gender activism. Next slide, please. So in terms of I'll take a look at each region and then how the funding is generated. So first, in terms of the U.S. Christian right, we can attribute over $81 million coming from 10 organizations, which are NGOs or think tanks. They've been increasingly establishing themselves in Europe. Some of them are on the EU Transparency Register or seeking accreditation at the Council of Europe. And all of them, as I'll explain, are linked to the big mega donors, as they're called in the US, affiliated with the US Republican Party and the Christian right over there. Next slide. So here is an overview of how it is that they're organized. And don't worry if you can't see it very perfectly on the PowerPoint, because unlike many other PowerPoint presentations, there's a whole report accompanying this that you can download and take a look at your leisure. So here we see that we can reestablish the food chain of money, of American money coming into Europe, where you have wealthy families associated with the US Christian right. For example, the top family is the DeVos family, worth over $5 billion. That produced Betsy DeVos, who was the US Education Secretary under President Trump. They've established a series of foundations, and same with a number of different families and religious orders in the US. These foundations then make grants to US organizations, and then a number of these US organizations then come over to Europe and either organize activities with European partners, and over the past few years have increasingly set up permanent offices in European capitals. And some of the ones that really we need to keep in mind are Alliance Defending Freedom, European Center for Law and Justice, and the World Youth Alliance. World Youth Alliance also gets money from the European Commission through the Erasmus project. Next slide, please. So here's a quick overview of where the US anti-gender organizations are established in Europe. So you can see there's a concentration in Brussels, Strasbourg, Geneva, Vienna, and also Rome. So those broadly correspond to where there's the headquarters of European institutions making decisions on human rights and democracy, and then also Rome for obvious reasons for their links to the Vatican. Next slide, please. Next, we go to Russia. So from Russia, we were able to identify 3 channels of funding related to anti-gender activism that come from Russia. One is from oligarchs. Another one is laundromats, which are all-purpose mechanisms to channel dark funding from Russia and over former Soviet republics over to other countries to meet various objectives. And then we also have state agencies being set up recently over the past 10 years by the Russian Federation, which are there to promote Russian interests. And Russia has taken on a socially conservative turn under President Putin. So when there's the promotion of Russian interests, this also means promotion of social conservatism at the current moment. So we have over $188 million coming from specifically 2 oligarchs. That's the money that we can trace. We don't know the funding for the laundromats and state agencies, but already just the 2 oligarchs put Russia in the 2nd place after the United States. Next slide. So you can see the Russian funding to anti-gender activism in Europe appears quite suddenly in 2012, spikes up very high in 2014. And then in 2014, you see then the impact of the Western sanctions on Russia, and then you see a sharp decline. A number of this funding also was meant to influence specifically European elections. And in relation to the oligarchs, you have 2 of them. One of them is Vladimir Yakunin, another one is Konstantin Malafeyev. Both of them have established a whole constellation of different organizations, entities, foundations, etc., which then all interact with each other. And then each of these then interacts with the global anti-gender movement through, for example, the World Congress of Families, or there's various bridges that have been established with the US Christian right, European far right political actors, and then also some of them are directly involved in some anti-gender platforms such as Citizen Go, which is responsible for a petitions-based advocacy against human rights. Next slide, please. And what this looks like in terms of Russian influence in Europe. So you see there are two of the oligarchs. We were able to trace their funding, and also thanks to investigative journalists in various places in Italy, among others, we're able to trace their funding from those entities linked to those oligarchs to a whole range of different issues and events and organizations based around Europe. So that includes the Dialogue of Civilizations in Berlin, crisis pregnancy counseling centers in Eastern Europe, and also far-right political parties in France and Italy. And then there's more, of course, in the report. Now I'll take a look at Europe, okay? So Europe accounts for the largest share of funding for anti-gender activism in Europe. This, I think, is really quite new because up until now, the focus really had been on what the Americans were spending in Europe on anti-gender activism. And while that was always an important point, I always suspected that Europe accounted for at least as much as American money. I mean, after all, we are as affluent as the Americans. There's no reason why we can't spend our own money on this type of stuff if we want to, and it turns out we are. So, for this 437 million coming from Europe, a few lessons to keep in mind. One, we were able to identify 20 foundations based in Europe that contribute to this, although how much of that is very much underestimated because most of the foundations are not transparent. There's transparency only for very few of them. But then also we're able to go into the accounts of a number of different NGOs and then regroup them into how they are most easily into their strongest focal point of anti-gender activism. And there we're able to see that there's coalitions that have formed around anti-abortion, anti-LGBT, social media mobilization, a pseudo-Catholic network, tradition, family, and property, and then Christian political activism. So I'll go through them a bit shortly, but already you can see that the funding from Europe is the region that has increased the most in terms of funding. So that it went from less than $20 million 10 years ago to exceed 60 million. And again, this is the region for which we have the most partial information, so that it is an underestimation of the total amount of money that is really out there. Next slide. So in terms of the private foundations, we have some of these here. So European Family Foundation, Jérôme Lejeune in France, there we have a lot of information. One of the biggest foundations in France, which funded La Manif pour tous, the homophobic initiatives in France, as well as anti-abortion activism. And you have a number of private foundations in Italy, Germany, Poland, which are sizable. In addition to not being transparent, one thing that we can see about each of these foundations is that they are associated with social, economic, and political elites. So that a number, for example, Sophie Inetfeld, a number of your former colleagues in the European Parliament then went on to establish a number of these foundations in Italy and in Spain. And then these then got engaged in European citizens' initiatives. A certain number of foundations from Germany are established by the former aristocracy of the country. And I thought that was a bit strange, but when you take a look at the former aristocracy or the aristocratic families in a certain number of countries, you find out that they are still today in 2021 among the wealthiest families in their respective countries, and they then set up private foundations. Next slide. Next slide. Yep. Okay. And here we come to how the civil society actors have coalesced. So a few things to keep in mind here. Over the past 10 years, what there has been is a renewal of civil society activism against gender issues. And this has taken the form of them creating a whole number of different coalitions. And as they create coalitions, they are then able to better fundraise for their anti-gender activism. So among the first of these was anti-abortion activism around One of Us, then followed anti-LGBT activism around La Manif pour tous and Mom, Dad, and Kids, a failed citizens initiative. Each one of these, if you add up the numbers from their national members, were able to generate 31 million and 23 million respectively. Then we have the European Christian Political Movement. This is a creation of two small Dutch political parties who found little orphan Christian politicians and parties around Europe, got EU money from the European Parliament, and then since then have been able to generate $8 million. And then from that, they serve as an entry point to a whole range of anti-gender organizations by republishing their work and then circulating that as ECPM documentation on abortion, on euthanasia, and on different issues. Then we have the social media mobilization based in Spain. And then we have TFP, this network of pseudo-Catholic cult-like organizations based in both France and in Poland. And they were able to generate from their national members over $113 million over the past year. And that also is a very big underestimation, since there's only about, we're still missing data for about a third of the membership. Next slide, please. Okay, then we'll take a look at beneath the iceberg. And so now that we have an idea of how much money is involved, how do they fundraise for it? Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So then in terms of how they fundraise, one is through astroturfing. So we found two models here where basically the actors, what they do is they generate petitions, and then from petitions, you then have a list of names and contact details, which then you can transition to hitting them up for donations. And in the case of tradition, family, and property, sending them cheap Catholic paraphernalia and then asking them to buy it or to give donations in return for example, a miraculous medallion or something like this. From this way of generating revenue, it may seem very sort of very outdated or a bit labor intensive, but we know that new manufacturing centers and new warehouses for this Catholic paraphernalia have opened up in Krakow in Poland recently, and just this month or last month in the Netherlands, in order to do the same thing. And from that, they're able to generate, out of the $113 million TFP generates, there's perhaps maybe 30-40% of it, which comes from this type of fundraising. And then you have a similar model based in Germany and in Spain, where you have petitions-based social mobilization, then transitioning to fundraising. And then from fundraising, then you get to grow the organization, and then they become politically active. So that then we see the transition of civil society actors to become political actors through the new alt-right political parties of Alternative für Deutschland and Vox in Spain, so that you see a similarity of leadership personalities from civil society into the political parties. Next slide. Then we have social and economic elites, which account for a big part of which account also for one aspect of where the money comes from. So there's the 1%. So this is private sector individuals and companies, etc., that provide sponsorship or support to anti-gender actors. And then we have, again, these clerical aristocratic networks, these aristocratic families that I mentioned, who have established private foundations. We have a number of them that play a role in the governance of anti-gender organizations. So even an American anti-gender organization such as Alliance Defending Freedom has relationships with German countesses and princes from European microstates. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. Okay. And here's a snapshot of some of the European companies whose leadership have been shown to be close to anti-gender organizations. So that we know, for example, that the former president, CEO of the French insurance company AXA is very much involved in La Manif pour tous. And then you have the same thing across national level, across national levels in all the different individual countries. So this may be familiar to those of you who are active at a certain national level, but what we lack in Europe is an overview of what's happening across different countries, so that the French will be familiar with AXA, the Spanish with La Caixa, but maybe not with each other's economic elites. And like this, at least it allows us to better organize. Next slide. Next slide. Yes. Next is state support. So what struck me was how successful some of these anti-gender actors have been able to tap into public money, into state support. And basically, we can break it down into 5 main categories. One is misleading women, where we see that anti-gender actors, they were able to get funding from public authorities to mislead women by creating crisis pregnancy counseling. And this is in countries like Spain, Italy, Malta, Slovakia, but also the Netherlands. A next area was indoctrinating youth in getting getting funding in order to develop school curricula based on religious teaching. Then there's political activism, organizing to tap into public money. One that's important to keep in mind, but also quite a bit has been written about this in academia, and that is serving as a government echo chamber, where we see that illiberal governments are funding anti-gender civil society actors, basically to provide external support for their illiberal tendencies. So we see this very well developed in Poland and in Hungary. And then finally, it's reached a level where some states are engaging in soft diplomacy, convening international gatherings, and then providing a platform for certain types of ideas which work to undermine human rights. A very good example of that is what Poland has been doing with Hungary has been doing with demography, and Poland in aligning itself with US initiatives against abortion rights. Also, one area of state support that I want to point out is that some of the anti-gender funders themselves benefit from institutionalized state support mechanisms, so that there's ways for the churches to be funded through institutional mechanisms. And a number of these aristocrats that I mentioned are large property owners and themselves benefit from big subsidies from the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union. Next slide. Religious networks, naturally, they play an important role here. What we see here is that the religious networks are organized around their main religious affiliations. So in Europe, we have Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox networks. So with the Catholic one, we have the Conference of European Bishops, which works in very close partnership with a number of anti-gender NGOs, including some of the US-funded ones from the first part of this presentation. We see Catholic movements also playing an important part. And then also what's interesting is that you see members of the clergy or officials from the Vatican and the Holy See playing a leadership role in the governance of certain anti-gender organizations. So that there's one organization, the Dignitatis Humanae Institute, which has a board composed of not less than 10 cardinals. Then we have Protestant networks organized mainly around the Dutch Reformed Church, and then finding little groups in different countries. And there, what I found interesting is their tendency to organize parliamentary prayer breakfasts, which serve to socialize political elites onto increasingly regressive agendas. And then you have Orthodox networks where there's been national Orthodox churches have been gradually active against gender issues. Next slide. So I'm near the end here. So just 5 components of the new anti-human rights infrastructure in the EU. One, we have new transnational coalitions. Secondly, we have new political projects which take anti-gender activism into the world of, into the center of politics. We have new social media platforms appearing not just in Spain, but active also globally. We have a professionalized infrastructure targeting EU institutions with anti-gender objectives, and they have infiltrated power structures in all levels, more deeply in certain countries than in others, but very deeply in certain countries, and they're attempting to do this in an increasing number of countries. Next slide. So here's just an overview of what many people here will be familiar with Agenda Europe and the secretive network. Here's a picture of their meeting in Warsaw. And so in terms of Agenda Europe, you can see that the way it was made possible was through the support of US actors, such as the Acton Institute and Alliance Defending Freedom, a Spanish actor funded in part by Russia, EU money from the ECPM, this TFP organization, and church money coming from the International Theological Institute in Vienna. You can see all of them working together towards a common objective. Next slide. And then I'll end here in terms of just posing a question of what does this mean now? So in about 2 weeks or less than that, the European Parliament will be voting on the Matic report, the first report on SRHR since 2013. It's already come under heavy religious extremist attack. And just last week, they announced the creation of an international coalition to defeat the Matic report. And here's the logo of the organizations in this international coalition. So after what I've just presented, we can see a little bit who's behind this international coalition. So you have 3 of the logos there with that weird lion's head. That is from Tradition, Family and Property, the strange pseudo-Catholic cult. Next, you have the Hungarian organizations. You have this funny chess piece with HFI, a Hungarian name up at the top there. Those are Hungarian government-funded non-governmental organizations. So there you have the hand of the Hungarian government directly in trying to influence something at the European Parliament. Then you have one of us and a number of the national organizations there, Catholic Church supported anti-abortion organizations. And then you have the people, the logos with all the little families holding hands. You have the transnationally coordinated but local homophobic initiatives. And so this is the coalition that is mounting itself to defeat the Matic report in about 2 weeks. So I think I'll end here just to emphasize how the funding then translates into actual activism. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, big round of applause, Neil. It's really amazing and horrifying at the same time. I think what I find very difficult about this topic is that it's very difficult indeed to get a complete picture. You have to be an expert in order to see all the connections. It's really like a spider's web. And I had just one question, because you showed that at some point there is a kind of surge in the funding. It has quadrupled. Do you have any explanation for that? What has triggered that surge?
The only thing I can say is that over this period, the different actors have decided to organize themselves transnationally. And as they organized themselves, they were able to make themselves more appealing for different fundraising initiatives. So that we see, for example, once they were able to organize themselves around anti-LGBT activism, then we see that once this organization is there, funders start to appear and they actively fundraise for that. Separately, they've created new structures where they're able to hoover up money from the general public through social media enterprises, which did not exist before. So there's a whole range of different ways that they have innovated in order to attract more money and generate more money in order to meet these objectives.
Okay, so there wasn't one event that triggered it. It was just, but I think this is a lesson we have to draw, because I mean, for many years we've been trying to get, let's say, the progressive forces, those who want to advance equality, etc., choice, to get them organized. But it's always very nice and friendly, but we're not the same kind of. We don't have this battle spirit, if you want it. But I think we should be alarmed. The alarm bells should be ringing. This is a wake-up call. If we hadn't had wake-up calls before your previous reports, and I think it also demonstrates, I mean, this report, probably more than any of your previous work, demonstrates so clearly that this is not just a woman's issue or a women's issue. It's about raw power. If you look at the some of the names and the connection, it's about power, very much. And we should be, we should realize that and not just make alliances to advance rights, but to also understand what's behind it. Neil, it's really amazing. I'm very, very impressed. Many, many thanks for doing this work. It's a lot of work. I can see that, and it's going to prove to be really incredibly valuable to our political work, certainly. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce the panelists. First of all, David Paternotte, who's also an old friend, of course, who is a lecturer in sociology at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. He's also chairs the management committee of the Inter-University Master's Degree in Gender Studies of the Walloon-Brussels Federation. And David focuses on gender, sexuality, and social movements with a particular interest in transnational mobilizations and, more recently, anti-gender movements. And we have had indeed sessions with both David and Neil before, very rich sessions. And then, contrary to what I announced earlier, we do not have Claire Provost, as I said, but we have Tatev Hovhanessian. I really hope I didn't massacre your name too badly. And you've been a journalist for over 10 years, working at leading Armenian media outlets, but more importantly, or as importantly, right now, assistant editor for Europe and Eurasia at Open Democracies, tracking the Backlash team. And Backlash here is a very important term, I think. You joined the team in March 2020 when the whole pandemic broke out. So I suppose you've been spending a lot of time working on this behind your screen. So very welcome, both of you. I suggest that I give each of you the floor for about 5 minutes to react, and then we're going to open for questions and debate. First, David.
So thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Neil, for the invitation. I mean, it was really a pleasure to read this report before anyone else. And I think, I mean, usually people who know me know that I never say that, but I think that this report is truly exceptional. So, I mean, I've checked, it's already online, so you can already download it during the session if you like, because I think we learn a lot. And it's also extremely addictive. So although I had many other things to do for marking and everything, I spent most of Saturday night and Sunday morning reading and reading again over the report. And I think it has a very modest title because it's only tip of the iceberg, but I think it contains major insights, as it has already been said, about the funding, but also beyond, about how the anti-gender movement is structured in Europe today. So I think it's something to read again and again and again and think about, especially when you try to design strategies. And what I will try to do in the short time I have is just give you 5 reasons why I think it's important, and then insist again on 3 contributions of this made by this report. And the first thing I think, and it was clear in the presentation, is that it is precise, it is accurate, it is factual, but at the same time, it is really nuanced. It never falls into conspiracy theories, which is often a trap we can fall into when we work on those topics. And as Sophie has just said, I mean, this is something that was made over several years of work. You can only do that if you have a deep knowledge of the topic. So if you have 6 months and you don't know the topic, there is no way you're going to be able to produce that report. So I think, I mean, the work behind it is very important. The second strength, I think, is that it is really transnational. Not all EU countries are covered, and it would be very difficult. but most of them, and the biggest one, many countries are covered in the EU and also some outside of the EU, which also relies on the capacity and the network to follow what's happening in different countries. And you have like 10 pages of references at the end of the report with references in many languages, which is also the capacity to find those informations, to read them, to understand them, and then to put everything together in one document, which is actually not easy to do and doesn't happen very often. The third reason, I think, is that, I mean, it is also very pedagogical. Also, I think the explanation, I mean, the presentation was very clear. But for instance, you have 13 pages of annexes. You have 7 annexes. And I think this is really making a great job in identifying who are the actors, who are the organizations. So you have lists, you have tables, you have all sorts of different tools that allow you to understand something that is actually very complex. The fourth reasons, I think, and especially, I mean, in the report, you have 2 case studies, one on One of Us and one on Citizen Go. And I think the case studies are doing an excellent job at explaining how it works concretely, how money is raised, how money is invested, and what you see, and this is sometimes hard to understand even when reading this report, is that you have a very complex system of revolving doors, of multiple hats. So you see the same names again and again with different positions and different roles in different organizations. And to try to understand who is doing what is actually not easy, even in the report, and it's much more difficult when you try to write such a thing, with mechanisms like people receive money that at the same time will become donors and just also act as people connecting other donors with other grantees. And the final reason, I think it is also probably the most exhaustive report we have today on transnational activism around anti-gender issues in Europe. So it's very also, it's not only about funding, but it's also about the organizations and the actors active at the transnational level, when often research is made more at national level. And then the 3 main contributions I would like to insist on. The first idea is that there is not one single actor in Europe. We have already said that a few times. Neil has repeated that, but I think it's important to insist on that. It's not an easy phenomenon. It's not a simple phenomenon. And often we think we know about it and we know very little. And it shows the importance of research in trying to address the issue. And what we see is a dense network, or networks, probably, because I think there are different networks of organizations with a global outreach, but it's not only global, and it's what our friend Sonia Correa has called the anti-gender hydra. It's really a monster with several heads. And we need to understand that, to understand what we're trying to address as a problem. It has several implications. These people do not have the same interest, do not have the same objectives. Some of them don't like each other, the same way that progressive actors do not necessarily like each other. However, they find ways to work together. And what Neil was just mentioned about the Matic report is a very good example of how these different people, more and more, are coming together and finding ways to work together, which was not easy and obvious at the beginning when they started to do that. And so for us, I think we need to understand better still, and we're progressing, but slowly, how these constellations are constructed, how they're sustained. And I think the sustained thing is more important. What are the weak spots? And also, who are the brokers? Who are the people connecting these groups? And what are the crossroads in terms of events, in terms of ideas? Where do these people find each other? In terms of places like conferences, and Neil details many of those events, but also in terms of ideas. Where do they find these junctions, allowing them to work together, although they may have different interests? Or if you take religious groups, it's very easy. Usually they hate each other, but still they work together, and they're competitors for the market of faith, but still they work together on this. And this is also true for money. What we see is that we have we have multiple flows of monies, but they're also interconnected. And as I said, with people with multiple hats and revolving doors. And I think we see exactly the same mechanism about money. The second idea that is crucial, and I'm very happy about the report, is that it was, I mean, we have been obsessed for years about the idea of foreign interference, which I think it's true. There is money coming from abroad, but I think it's too easy and too simple to think that it's only something that is exported to Europe or imported in Europe. It's not only something that comes from abroad, that has been said about Europe, that has been said about Africa, only the bad US actors coming to Europe or coming to Africa and selling their things. No, it's actually a truly European phenomenon. And about a bit less than 70% of the money comes from Europe. What you see also, and that is important, is that the money coming from the US and from Russia, and Russia partly because of sanctions from the European sanctions, has decreased over years. So what you see is actually today the money is even more European than it used to be a few years ago, when they probably invested in European actors have taken over. And what we see again, we see this key year of 2013-14 that we have identified in reports, key year in mobilization, and we see exactly the same key year or key years in terms
David,
of...
can I ask you to come, because we have little time left, and I would give the floor to Tatev and back to Neil.
Yeah. And so the final thing I would like to say is really to move beyond the backlash narrative to try to understand, and I like the quote by Picasso, I didn't know in the conclusion, about this idea that every act of creation is first an act of destruction. So to try to think about what is created. And I will just end with something else, and also connecting to what I have to do at 3 o'clock. I just got an email from ADF International about freedom of speech on campuses. What is just now, and what is the image is a cross. What is very interesting is that when you start digging in other things, like I do in academic freedom, for instance, if you look at the law that is currently debated in the UK about freedom of speech.
David, can I really ask you, because we have really like 9 minutes left.
It's really, I mean, it's ADF International, again, battling behind this law in the UK as well on academic freedom. So it's really connecting the struggles. And that's the final idea I would like.
Okay, sorry for being blunt, but the clock is ticking and we all have to break up in 9 minutes. So I give the floor to Tatev.
Yes, thank you. I'll be very short. So congratulations on the launch of this unique, incredible, and very important report. As you may know, at Open Democracy, we have been tracking the international spendings of US Christian rights groups that oppose sexual and reproductive rights for a very, very long time. But in reality, we have been extremely surprised by this report's findings, and especially the amount of funding by European anti-gender organizations. I think that much more investigative research and work should be done in this regard, and we should also know what that means for European societies. We need to know how this affects ordinary people's life, what are the consequences for people. For example, our previous research shows numerous examples of this kind of human impacts. And for example, we have talked a woman, girl Helena from Norway. Now she's 25 and she was 16 when she was denied contraception by her doctor, based on religious ground. So she says that it felt like indirect slut shaming. And after this year, she's remembering that, and how she was embarrassed, and she's saying that one result of doctors refusing contraception could be more unwanted teen pregnancies. And this is just one example from Norway, which is considered to be the most progressive, happiest country in Europe. So we can imagine how what is happening in other parts of all this continent, and what is happening is just. This is just one example. What is happening when women's rights have come into crosshairs of powerful US Christian right groups. And as journalists, I think we need to speak up, we need to investigate more, we need to dig deeper and deeper, and until we have some real world impact. That's what we do at our project, at Tracking the Backlash Project. Every day we are investigating organized threats to human rights, and we are trying to build this more inclusive media ecosystem, because we believe that if we change media, we can change the debate. And I think that this report is very important for us as journalists, and it will be, there is a lot of to do based on these findings, and we just need to work. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We've got a few minutes left, so I'm afraid we do not have an opportunity for questions, but I think, just read the report. Neil, can I give you the floor for 2 minutes to wind up?
Thank you very much, Sophie. I'll take less than 2 minutes. I've spoken enough already, so thank you very much for spending this afternoon with us for this report. In producing this report, what I hope is that it can provide at least a certain basis of information to organize the thinking and the knowledge already on the funding behind the anti-gender movement, and then others can take it forward and deepen it and go further into it, so that academics like David, media practitioners such as Tatef and Open Democracy, they can use this as a starting point and then see where they can take this even further. And I'm hoping that this can be a launchpad for this. And then also for everyone listening to this, if you have additional information about different anti-gender funders that you're aware of and that have not been included in the report, well, you know how to reach EPF and how to reach me. Please let us know. I'm hoping this can be the start, really, so that we can together have a better idea of what the funding is like. And then from that knowledge, we can then better organize and how to respond to that. There have been great accountability campaigns done on the other side of the Atlantic against homophobic or anti-women funders. We've not done the same thing in Europe because we didn't have the knowledge. Hopefully, this is the beginning so that we can start organizing ourselves in order to address this challenge, which goes beyond even just human rights and the rights of women or LGBT, but really is a very deep political power problem, as Sophie has mentioned. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Neil. And you can count on us to do the necessary follow-up actions. I think, first of all, we need to get absolute transparency from the EU institutions about EU funding, because there's EU funding going into this, into ECPM, for example, ending up with these anti-choice movements. And I think even with the conditionality regulation for the budget, which we have in place now, the awareness of how EU funding is being abused for basically anti-EU and anti-European values agendas is really shocking. And it's not the first time we've heard about this, we learned about this, but we will very firmly put this on the political agenda. And I think we're also going to do that at national level. I certainly will do that with my political allies in the Netherlands, and I'm sure colleagues will do it in their respective countries. So I'm going to conclude this session. Apologies for the fact that there's no time for questions. Many thanks again, Neil, on behalf of everybody listening, but also on behalf of all the people who are going to benefit from the fact that your knowledge, what you have dug up, will be used to fight for European values and counter these anti-European values. So the big thank you to you, and we will spread the message as widely as we can. Have a very nice afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.